So you've seen the title and thumbnail, and before I go any further, I'll caveat by saying that the arguments I'm about to make will, in my opinion, apply to most runners, but not all runners. Obviously, elite runners still include VO2 max training in their schedule, and they clearly benefit from that. But most runners, by definition, are not elite. They haven't spent years, sometimes decades, running high mileage and developing their aerobic base. And they're not trying to eke out the last vestiges of improvement. There's still lots of low-hanging fruit available to amateurs, but as I'll soon argue, it's VO2 max training that's preventing them from accessing this fruit. I should also point out that in this video, I'll be using VO2 max training as a catch-all term for intensities above the anaerobic threshold. That is, if you were to take a lactate measurement during or right after your workout, it would show a reading in excess of LT2. The old shorthand used to be anything above 4 millimoles, but we now know that lactate profiles differ from person to person. Now, strictly speaking, this use of the term VO2 max may not be exact, and people may prefer to differentiate or subdivide intensities above the anaerobic threshold, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm not going to, and my arguments tend to cover all of these intensities to a certain extent. And one more caveat, and I have to do this at the start of almost every video. If you're doing VO2 max training and you're consistently improving and getting good results, then by all means, keep doing it. The arguments and recommendations I'm about to make aren't directed at you, but rather at runners who haven't improved for many years, and I know lots of people who are in this position. Despite consistent training and being desperate to improve, they just can't seem to work their way out of a plateau. I was in this position for at least 8 years, and I wish someone had have offered me an alternative approach sooner. So this video is simply intended to be that, an example or a prescription for how to potentially overcome stagnation. So argument number 1. VO2 max workouts aren't the best way to improve your VO2 max. So the idea that training at or very close to your VO2 max is the best way to improve it is a prevailing belief in the running community. The prominent running author and renowned coach Jack Daniels expresses this idea while explaining the purpose of his interval workouts. He states that their purpose is to maximize aerobic power, also known as VO2 max. And believing that the best way to improve any bodily function is to stress that function, I decided that the intensity had to be at or very close to VO2 max, or maximum heart rate. But Alan Couzens, a physiologist and triathlon coach, argues something very different. He provides an example of an athlete who improved his VO2 max from 53 milliliters per kilogram per minute to 74 milliliters per kilogram per minute after switching from a VO2 max heavy approach to a high volume, low intensity approach. This athlete had already been training for many years before making the switch. Couzens cites a study by Bobolk as his rationale for employing this strategy with this particular athlete. The study showed a relationship between training volume and cardiac stroke volume, one of the most modifiable and important factors in VO2 max. In a large EKG study of athletes' heart morphology, Bobolk discovered a strong, almost linear relationship between training volume and total heart volume. Couzens then goes on to state, the total volume of the athletes' hearts scaled not with the intensity of training, but with the average weekly volume. This makes good physiological sense, since we know that for the majority of people, stroke volume reaches its maximum limit at relatively low intensities of training, roughly 40 to 60% of VO2 max. Couzens suggests that the best way to increase VO2 max is for large volumes of training in this 40 to 60% of VO2 max range. For runners, that means lots and lots of very easy running over a long period of time. A similar conclusion was reached by Barbosa and others. In a study on 120 amateurs, in which training volume was increased by 32% over a 10-week period, VO2 max was increased by 10.44%. These findings, along with Couzens' and Bobolk's, run counter to the popular belief put forward by Daniels and others that the best way to improve VO2 max is to run at or close to VO2 max. To quote Couzens, VO2 max workouts are simply the icing on the cake. The obsession and overuse of VO2 max workouts in a year-round 7-day cycle sets runners up to scratch and claw for what Couzens estimates as a 6% potential improvement in VO2 max. Whereas an approach that prioritizes total training volume, which will likely reduce VO2 max workouts out of necessity, can improve VO2 max by up to 40%. Argument number 2. VO2 max workouts are heavily fatiguing and require a long recovery time. So I finished the previous argument by stating that if we are to prioritize total training volume, VO2 max training will be reduced out of necessity. That's because VO2 max training has a significant recovery cost, which prevents us from doing more volume, or at least as much as we could if we didn't include it in our schedule. When we train above the anaerobic threshold, we get what Steve Magnus refers to as a byproduct dump, which can take days or more to clear our system. This byproduct is made up of multiple metabolites and is accompanied by a raising of blood pH. If performed correctly, workouts that remain below the anaerobic threshold carry no such byproduct dump, and we can therefore perform them in not only higher volumes, but also higher frequencies. For athletes who are significantly aerobically underdeveloped, which is almost all amateur runners, this accumulation of far greater work at slightly lower but still relatively high intensities is profoundly beneficial. By avoiding the bottleneck of ultra-fatiguing workouts, we open up far more space for training that will provide a better aerobic stimulus. And we can perform this training in far greater volume. Number 3. The period of gain from VO2 max training is relatively short. So at this point, maybe you're shouting at the screen, VO2 max workouts must work because if they didn't, elite runners wouldn't do them. And just to reiterate, I'm not saying VO2 max training doesn't work at all. Part of my argument is that performing these workouts year round isn't a particularly effective way to train. Firstly, elite athletes from the 5K up to the marathon have highly developed aerobic systems, and the vast majority of them aren't focusing on VO2 max workouts year round. Even the athletes that purport to do some sort of higher intensity work in their base phase are either doing a very small amount relative to their overall volume, or they're performing these workouts with far more control than any such workout tends to be performed by an amateur runner. But for the most part, elite athletes periodize their training, as Haugen and others found in a study conducted on 59 of the world's greatest ever distance runners, including Kenenisa Bekele, Haile Gebrselassie and Sifan Hassan, to name a few. Elite long distance runners typically divide the training year into distinct ordered phases, with the explicit goal of peaking for major competitions. These phases include the preparation phase, the competition phase, and the transition phase. The preparation phase is typically divided into 2 segments, starting with the general preparation and followed by the specific preparation. The general preparation period involves an emphasis on high volumes of running in order to build an aerobic foundation. As athletes shift in the specific preparation period, the emphasis shifts towards more race-specific intensities. But as Haugen reveals, elite track runners are careful not to overuse race-paced training or introduce it too early in their annual cycle. Elite athletes and their coaches understand that the period of gain from VO2 max training is relatively short. An athlete will use these kinds of workouts in order to peak for their goal competition. Why? Because there's actually a trade-off between aerobic and anaerobic development. As Borg writes, if you pursue anaerobic training year-round, you will at best create a performance plateau as your aerobic and anaerobic energy systems eat into each other. It is a bit like constantly taking a few steps forward, only to take a few more backwards. You won't be going very far in the end. VO2 max, while a measure of aerobic capacity, is above the anaerobic threshold and therefore has a pronounced anaerobic component. In these workouts, a buildup of acidosis lowers the pH in the working muscles. This acidosis starts a cascade of unwelcome events within your body, including the sabotaging of the aerobic enzyme system on which your base fitness is built. For elite runners, having a strong anaerobic system is obviously a necessity given the nature of championship racing. Being able to change gears to respond to moves, to stick with an ever-increasing pace in the final kilometre, and to then muster a kick on the final lap. That's how medals are won. But this obviously comes with a cost to the aerobic system, so a balance must be struck. A VO2 max / anaerobic training block must be timed so that the goal race takes place at the moment of greatest upswing in anaerobic capacity, but before a decrease in aerobic capacity leads to a reduction in overall performance. This is called peaking, but this level of sophistication seemingly hasn't reached the recreational level yet. Coaches continue to prescribe VO2 max training year-round, either for logistical or ideological reasons, or just through plain ignorance. And look, VO2 max workouts are painful, mentally and physically demanding, and can often be demoralizing. When we add to the equation that they're also likely diminishing an athlete's aerobic development if performed too often, it seems illogical to include them in a constant 7-day cycle. And yet, people still line up to perform them each and every week, regardless of their improvements or lack of this type of training seems to produce. So what to do instead? Well, ultimately you need to work on developing your aerobic system without detracting from it with a heavy anaerobic stress each week. There are any number of ways of doing this, but I'll offer a few examples. Maybe you don't want to get rid of VO2 max workouts completely, and that's fine, but you could at least spend a few months doing a Lydiard-esque base phase. Here you drop the high intensity work temporarily and spend lots of time running in zones 1 and 2 with an emphasis on building your mileage. Then once you reintroduce higher intensity workouts, your aerobic system is at a new level and you're able to get far greater benefit from the harder workouts. Or if you're at an advanced level, you're brave enough and you have the time, you could opt for the Norwegian double threshold system. Here your focus would be on 1, building your mileage, and 2, maximising the amount of threshold running you can perform each week. Now, I don't expect many people to opt for this system as a whole, but you could take elements of it and try to adhere to the underlying principles. Under this system, you'd also be performing one smaller volumed, high-intensity workout in the form of 30-second hills each week. Marius Bakken calls this the X Factor workout, which is the icing on the cake. Or you could avoid the icing because you don't have a cake yet, save yourself loads of time, and opt for the system that's not only far more accessible for amateurs, but is going to give you the best bang for your buck. And that option is Norwegian singles, or sweet spot training, whatever you want to call it. Now, I've banged on about this training system enough, and you're probably sick of hearing me talk about it, but it'd be disingenuous of me to make a video about overcoming stagnation without mentioning the way that I did it. I didn't arrive at this system all at once, but the idea eventually crystallized that the more threshold training I do, and the more I phase out VO2 max, the faster I get. So this was a natural endpoint for me, a system made up solely of easy running and sub-threshold workouts. Now, if you'd like more information, there's plenty of links in the description, but I've waffled on enough for today, so I'll see you next time.